por estar aquí con nosotros esta noche. On behalf of all of us at the locally based independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, it's my pleasure to welcome you to an evening with David E. Hoffman in conversation with Vanessa Garcia and our special guest, Rosa María Payá Acevedo, to discuss David's riveting new biography, Give Me Liberty, the true story of Oswaldo Payá and his daring quest for a free Cuba, published by our friends at Simon & Schuster. There was a time, probably a couple of years ago, where I didn't know if this would ever be possible again, to have a packed room of people in person. And I never cease to be moved when I see it happening all over again. So thank you very much again for joining us. If you'll bear with me, I'd like to introduce each one of our guests and let you know a little bit about them. David E. Hoffman is a contributing editor and member of the editorial board of the Washington Post. He was previously assistant managing editor, foreign editor, Jerusalem correspondent, Moscow bureau chief, and White House correspondent for the newspaper. He's the author of The Dead Hand, The Untold Story of the Cold War Arms Race and Its Dangerous Legacy, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and The $1 Billion Spy, a true story of Cold War espionage and betrayal, which was a New York Times bestseller, as well as The Oligarchs, Wealth and Power in New Russia. To moderate this evening's program, we're joined by Vanessa Garcia, a Cuban-American multidisciplinary writer who has been writing about Cuba for nearly 20 years. She's a screenwriter, playwright, journalist, essayist, and novelist. She is the author of The Amparo Experience, an immersive show that people in Espanol called Miami's Hottest Ticket. You may have seen it when it was playing. It was fantastic. Her debut novel, White Light, won the International Latino Book Award and was one of NPR's best books of the year. Her picture book about her grandfather is just so cute that I just want to call attention to it. Will be published in October. And it's about her grandfather who escaped 3 tyrannies, Franco, Hitler, and then Castro. It's called What the Bread Says, and you can pre-order it at Books and Books. And our very, very special guest this evening, it gives me a little bit of goosebumps just to be near her, is Rosa María Payá Acevedo, the daughter of the late Oswaldo Payá, who received the European Parliament's Sakharov Prize and was a 2-time nominee for the Nobel Peace Prize, who was killed by the regime in 2012. Rosa María is a Cuban democracy activist and human rights defender. In 2015, she founded the citizen initiative Cuba Decide, a movement in favor of changing the political and economic systems in Cuba towards democracy. She is a graduate of physics at the University of Havana and of the Global Competitive Leadership Program at Georgetown University. She has been a lecturer and guest of honor at the United Nations, the Freedom Forum, the U.S. Congress, and multiple parliaments in Europe and the Americas. We'll start with a conversation between our guests, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, followed by a book signing, which will take place on the other side of the store. Books are available for sale at both of our friend registers, and this program, we think, is being recorded as an episode for our owner Mitchell Kaplan's podcast called The Literary Life. If you haven't checked that out, you should. Please silence your cell phones. That's important. I always forget to say that. And now, without further ado, let's give our guests a warm Miami welcome.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. You can feel the energy in the room of how important this book is. But before we start, I just want to give the microphone over to Ofelia Acevedo, Oswaldo's wife, for a few words.
Buenas noches a todos. Quiero darle la bienvenida a nombre de nuestra familia, especialmente al señor Hoffman y a su esposa Gables, que están esta noche con nosotros acá, a todos los que han organizado y hecho posible este evento, y a todos los que con su presencia esta noche nos acompañan. Estamos aquí para escuchar al escritor, periodista y amigo David Hoffman, que nos presenta su libro Gift Me Liberty, la biografía de Oswaldo Payá Acevedo. Precisamente cuando se cumplen el 22 de julio próximo, 10 años de su asesinato junto a Harold Cepero por órdenes de Fidel y Raúl Gables. La existencia de un libro sobre la vida de Oswaldo fue siempre un anhelo mío desde el primer día que nos arrebataron su vida. Hoy, gracias a Dios, es una realidad. Y no pudo Oswaldo tener un biógrafo mejor que David Hoffman. David ha hecho una exhaustiva investigación y lo ha hecho con tanto amor que estamos eternamente agradecidos a él y a su familia, que sabemos lo ha apoyado generosamente en este proyecto. Muchas gracias, David. Cuando los que conocimos a mi esposo hayamos desaparecido, quedará este libro para nuestros nietos y para las futuras generaciones conozcan de Oswaldo Payá y de su legado. Un hombre que dedicó su vida hasta el sacrificio de entregarla por la libertad plena de los cubanos. A todas las personas que han colaborado con el señor Hoffman, con sus testimonios, todos los miembros de nuestra familia, a los amigos y compañeros de Oswaldo en las diferentes etapas de su vida, a todos los que han contribuido en algo para que este libro sea una realidad, a todos ustedes muchas gracias. Quiero agradecer a todos los que nos acompañan esta noche e invitarlos a disfrutar de este programa que han preparado. Que tengan todos una feliz noche y muchas gracias.
I just want to get in a few thank yous. First of all, to all of you for coming. And I never imagined in these dark 2 years of pandemic that we would be back to big full rooms like this. I'm just overjoyed. And thank you to Books and Books. I spent many, many hours roaming these stacks, buying books here. It's the absolutely most lovely place to launch this book. My name is on the book, but really the reason the book happened is my wife, Carol, who's here. She was the first and best advocate for doing it when the idea first came up. She went with me to Cuba. She pushed me all the time to make it the best book possible. I'd also like to thank the Payás. Rosa María and I have been talking about this for a decade, and she was my incredible partner, helping me understand her father, correcting me when I was wrong often, and Ophelia and your family, all of you gave generously. You opened your doors, you opened the archives. I really believe that I was only able to understand Oswaldo because of your generosity and your trust. I'd also like to thank Minnie Marquez from Simon & Schuster, my editor. You can't believe how important it is to have an editor who understands your story. And Mindy immediately, from the first day, saw what this was about, and sort of like the captain on the ship, she knew where we were headed. And that was so, so important. Thank you. Also, Milena Vasquez, who is my primary researcher, is here with her family. Elena almost got me thrown out of the Cuban Heritage collection for shouting in joy when she found something there. I also must thank Gustavo Gutierrez and his mother Yolanda Gutierrez for their incredible help in telling the story of Gustavo Gutierrez and his efforts to write the 1940 Constitution. Gustavo is the grandson. Yolanda is the daughter of Gustavo Gutierrez, who plays an important role in the Cuban Republic, as I described in the book. Miriam Martinez. Miriam Martinez was my first translator and also a partner. Eloise is here, also wonderful translator. Andres Flores, who made a terrific contribution and told me of his effort to collect signatures, which did not end very well either. We are sure glad that you're here. Andres, thank you. And very last, I want to just thank two people who are not here. My bosses at the Washington Post, Fred Hyde and Jackson Field, who from the minute we first heard from Rosa Maria pushed me, supported this project. And, you know, I had a dream that I would give the book someday to Fred Hyde, who I had known for 30 years. And on December 4th, he died suddenly of a heart attack. And I was never able to give him the book. But his spirit is in this, and Jackson's too. And they were very, very determined that the Washington Post stand for democracy and human rights in the world. And we still are.
Yes.
So we're going to begin with a conversation, and then we're going to open it up to questions. And even though we're speaking in English, I would say that if you have questions in Spanish, feel free to ask them in Spanish. But that's for a little bit later. Right now, we're just going to talk a little bit. As everyone has been mentioning, it has been a year since the July 11th protests, about a year, almost a year, and 10 years since the death of Oswaldo Payá. So this could not be a more perfect moment to speak about this, specifically because as we saw people going out into the street holding out this sign, this book traces back to with whom that started, with Oswaldo Payá. And it does not only speak of his death, but of his life and his legacy, which we haven't had before. I'm going to read you 3 sentences, and then I'm going to ask some questions. But this is what David says are the questions at the center of this book. How do people gain the right to think and speak freely, advocate their views, follow their conscience, work and assemble as they desire without persecution? How do they secure the right to choose their leaders and set the course of their own future? What does it take to attain such freedoms? These questions are at the heart of this book, the story of one man's journey into the whirlwind of dictatorship. And that's the story that's at the center of this. So, David, what brings you to Oswaldo Payá in the first place? We can sort of piece together a little bit of the cross-interest having come from where you were researching the Soviet Union and writing about it, but what brings you to Oswaldo?
I've always had a fascination with what does it take for one man to stand up against such a totalitarian system? And by asking the question, what inspiration and courage and dedication and means did Oswaldo do this? By asking that question, it led me to his whole life. And the answers are that Oswaldo had some very, very strong beliefs that through a lifetime of effort, he had to realize. It was not an easy road. It was a hard road. But one of those beliefs was that rights are bestowed upon us by God and not by the state and not by Fidel. And he said we have the right to rights. And also, he believed that Cubans themselves have to be the protagonists of their own history, that they cannot be just spectators. With those beliefs, he then struck out, and it's an amazing story, over 30, 40 years, from the time he was really young until his last breath. He was pursuing this sort of North Star, trying in different ways. And the book really tells you what were those ways? What worked? What failed? Up, down, disappointment, and triumph.
And Rosa, on your end, what was it like to have someone come in and say, I want to write the story of your father, particularly when it was so fresh, because I'm told it was very early after his death that David contacted you. This has been a project, it seems, 5 years in the depth of making and 10 years, really, in the making.
Vanessa, it was just the answer to our prayers, especially when we were just arriving into this country, forced to exile by repression and death and violence, and with this big feeling and conviction that my father and of course, I mean, his person embodied the alternative, and that's one of the reasons why Fidel and Raúl Castro believed that they had to kill him, but also because the real effort was to kill his legacy, to kill the idea, to kill the will within the Cuban people to change that regime for good. And Fidel and Raúl failed. They couldn't. But the fact that we have now that legacy, not only for the Cuban people, but for the world, with the wonderful research that they have done, but also with, you just heard it, with this big insight about what are the motivations behind this man and behind this idea, and all that is so wonderful explained and exposed in the book, that it was 10 years ago or 9 years ago, it was an answer to our prayers, and right now is the reason why we say thank you in our prayers.
And both of you have at the center of your answers, where does this come from? Where did the impetus for Oswaldo to do what he did, where did it come from? And we spoke a little bit earlier today about Catholicism, and I mean, his movement was called the Christian Liberation Movement, even though it was a secular movement. And what did you find from the outside researching was that center that he drew from Catholicism, those God-given rights, especially in Cuba? Yes, you.
Oswaldo's faith was a door into his ideas about truth and freedom. And when he was young, there were mentors in the parish church, El Salvador del Mundo. And one of them was Father Alfredo Petit. And Father Petit told the young people in the parish and in the church, he said, here you can be free. Within the church, we can have open and free discussions. And I think that this was a formative influence on Oswaldo. And he associated his faith with the idea that rights are bestowed by God and that it was fine to ask for them. By the way, that was not something that was accepted out on the street outside the church. And I tell the story in the book that something as simple as hanging a sign on the church steeple saying Merry Christmas was considered subversive. And Oswaldo and two of his friends, they made up the sign, flashing lights out of some old parts, and they took a ladder and they climbed up on that steeple and hung it. An small act of defiance, but it showed Oswaldo felt nobody could tell him he didn't have rights. And his faith opened it. Later, he organized a study group at the church. One of their first subjects was the Felix Varela and the lessons of Varela. They read him and talked about it. Later, in the lobby of this beautiful church, really, just outside by the door, there were often discussions on Sunday about public events that were not discussed elsewhere. People would bring books that had been smuggled to the island. They would talk about radio broadcasts they had heard. All of these things were part of Oswaldo's young development in life. And I think the idea sunk in that his faith and his understanding of what the church was were the same. That it stood for freedom, and this led to some disappointment later, but that's where it began.
And I think, Rosa, in your, I mean, you run Cuba now, which is to a certain degree the son of the daughter of his movement. And though it's secular, I think that some of those core values are still there. But I want to talk a little bit about the Varela Project. Speaking of the Varela Project, which is named after Felix Varela, which is a priest and an independence fighter for Cuba. Can you tell us what the Varela Project was?
Yes.
Someone will find it. They will find it. They're searching.
The Varela Project was the culmination in a way of several motivations and ideas that my father could actually transform into action. There are several of them. You know what the Varela Project is. It's an initiative of law. He found the crack in the Constitution that he could use to try to use the system against the system and change finally the system through the will of the people, with the participation of the people, but with that binding element that he could find in the communist constitution, that of course was not giving legitimacy to that constitution, but just being trying to use what he had in that moment. And of course, the core questions of the Varela Project, the core demands of the Varela Project are the demands that we are still demanding today: freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the possibility to have free enterprise, the amnesty for the political prisoners, free and fair elections. But there is something that is in the Varela Project too, and it is that it's a call for a referendum. So he's not asking permission for the regime. He is inviting the Cuban people to be the protagonists of their own history, and that's key in the way that my father ambition changed in Cuba, and that's an aim, and that's an element that guides the whole process and what came after too. But there is a second element, and it's that just as the people that went out into the streets last July 11, each one in some moment took the personal decision of crossing the door of their houses and joining that protest in the Varela Project. Everything began with a personal decision. And that was something that my father called personal liberation, liberación, right? And he was convinced that in order to have a national liberation, national movement, you need the gathering, the union of all those personal decisions that my father respected so much.
So,
That's something, I think Rosa María touches something very important. The people who signed this petition, the Varela Project, they signed their names, they put their addresses, they gave their identity numbers, they stood up to be counted. They wanted to be there to make these statements. And I thought when I first heard of it, this is remarkable. Thousands of people are saying they want democracy and putting their names and conquering their fear. And Oswaldo said, don't be afraid. Fear is something they impose upon you. Don't have it. And people did it.
Yeah, that's so important. That's so important because he also acknowledged it. He's not saying we are not afraid anymore. He's saying we are not going to allow to be dominated by fear anymore.
So yeah, one of the things as a writer looking at the book, one of the beautiful elements of it is the tracing of the seed that was left from the 1940 Constitution, which is what Oswaldo Payá grabs onto, which allows for these 10,000 signatures to bring a citizen initiative. So I'm fascinated and amazed at what this relationship must have been like, and feel like this is a historical family sitting in front of us, because it was the thing that you do in your book that's so wonderful is that you see the Constitution trampled by Batista and then totally gutted by Castro, and the seedling survives throughout the book. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about how this is a structure question, but how you thought to put together, like what are the threads that you felt were important to carry this narrative forward?
Anytime a journalist takes up a subject, this journalism is in my veins. It was my entire life. I came to the Washington Post 40 years ago, and they taught me to find out not only what happened, but why did it happen. And when I heard about the Varela Project and what Oswaldo had done, I wanted to know why. What was the context for it? And I discovered, of course, that in the Cuban Republic, from independence until 1959, there was a great deal of discussion about making a modern democracy and what would involve for state and society to do that. And Gustavo Gutierrez, the jurist and politician, and Yolanda's father and Gustavo's grandfather, was a pioneer at doing this. And all during those decades, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, they thought, we want to be a country that is ruled by rule of law. We want to have competition that is free and fair in elections. And the 1940 Constitution grew out of these crises and yearning for change. And believe me, it was not a difficult time. The Machedato, the years of Batista, these were not particularly great experiments in democracy. And many people in the 30s discovered Jose Marti. People think now of Marti as this great hero, but actually it wasn't until the 1930s, until a biography of Marti, that people rediscovered what he had written and said about the ideals of Cuba. And Gustavo Gutierrez essentially sought to do something concrete, to write a constitution that would embody those values. And when the Constitution was approved in 1940, and Batista took off his uniform and ran as a civilian president, it began a dozen years, really the best years of constitutional rule, of true efforts to make a real democracy. And of course, this is what was later lost.
Yeah. And it's followed throughout the book in such a wonderful way. And the other thing that we really sense in the book, and that you both have spoken about already, is the suffocation and the fear inside of the regime. The other sort of parallel structure is all the threats to all those effectual goals and to Oswaldo's life. And as someone who is American, who lives here, how did you, and we have a character, which in this book is a character, but is a real person. The tragedy of this book is that it reads like a horror story, but it's actually the truth. Is Edgar, who's state security, and he follows him. This is how did you get inside of that to describe it in the way it does?
For me,
yes.
Cuban state security was trained by the East German Stasi. And the East German Stasi had created a system of police state in East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, that was, relied on complete control. People were informants in every workplace, in every building, in every neighborhood. And this system was taught to the Cubans. And then it involved methods to try and suppress dissent and repress people without force. The Stasi pioneered psychological warfare against their own people. I describe in the book what these methods were because they wrote an 800-page handbook about how to do it, how to subvert people and inform on them and smear them and turn them against each other. Cuba sent officials from state security to the special university of the Stasi. It exists in Potsdam to study these methods, and then they began to apply them against people like Oswaldo Payá. So there's a very direct line between one of the most feared and terrible secret police organizations of the 20th century and what's happened in Cuba.
I will say that when I visited Berlin and went to the Stasi Museum, I went with my mother and we were looking at everything that was there, and she just started crying because she said, this is Cuba. So reading that, just the fact that it's in writing, I think is incredibly valuable. And I want to know from you, Rosa, what that was like from the inside, because there's a difference between us from the outside looking in and having lived it as your father saw it.
You know, I don't know how they did it. I mean, I don't know how my mother and my father and my whole family, my uncle is here. I don't know how they did it, but they took that pressure for us, and they took it from us in many ways. I mean, of course, we know from very early that we were not that welcome at the school, that the security visited our teachers, our friends when we were growing, even the fathers of our friends when we were teenagers. They were even in our parties. They were in my 15-year party. They tried to menace our guests. All that happened, but I didn't know who Edgar was. I didn't know what that was during my whole life. I knew about Edgar recently. I don't know how they did it, but they keep an environment of a perception of safety. When I was around my father, I was convinced that nothing would happen.
Which is incredible, especially after everything that you write, David, and what your parents were holding, I think, and what was.
And I'd like to add that this is very, very difficult for Ophelia, and I understand, because she and Oswaldo promised each other when they were married as newlyweds, we will build a free country for our children. And at the end, they didn't. They tried heroically. Imagine how hard that is.
Yes. At the same time, we had an experience that very few people had and have the privilege of living in the midst of a totalitarian state, and was the experience of being free to be free, which is my friends at the school. I have said this several times before that. My friends at the school. Some of them sometimes even talk to me with some envy, because they told me, okay, you can say that because everybody already knows you. Or you can say that because they're not going to have trouble in your house. But what my friends listen in their houses is, okay, you can never repeat what you hear in your house in the school. What my father had to say about it is, hey, you say whatever you want and we'll see. That's an unbelievable, strange, weird experience to have in the midst of a totalitarian regime, and they gave that to us.
So one of my questions, and I was going to ask this later, but it goes better right here, is the book's title, David, I imagine is, well, you tell me where the title comes from.
Well, the title comes from Patrick Henry's famous declaration. And before the legislature, it was in Virginia. And it was at the end of a great debate about the future of the United States. And he was actually quite frustrated. And I think that Oswaldo also shared those Patrick Henry sentiments that at some point you have to say, give me liberty. And I think that Oswaldo Payá was like Andrei Sakharov against Soviet power, or Václav Havel in the Czechoslovakia. He was of that caliber, that person for whom "Give Me Liberty" wasn't a slogan. It was a life. It was dedication.
And it's "Give Me Liberty" or "Give Me Death," right? So my question is, which is it in the case of Oswaldo Payá?
Well, that's easy to answer because he repeated once and again. He was always such an oppositioner from Patria o Muerte. He was always advocating for freedom and life, for liberty and life, and he lived till the end for life.
I want to ask a question about books, because this is from an anecdote that you told me, David. We're surrounded by books, and we're obviously talking about the value of this book in my lap right now. And you talked about a moment where you were doing early research, and Ophelia was bringing out a lot of material, and that Oswaldo had been very fond of gadgets and had a camcorder early on, and that at some point he scanned his bookshelf, and that was of great value to you to see what he read. What from what he was reading made him, you think, the person that he was?
So with this Handycam, Oswaldo was actually preparing to rehearse the talk that he was going to give by talking into his own Handycam, sitting in a rocking chair. It's a wonderful speech to hear him do this. He was alone in the room, but beforehand, it's kind of a test. He scanned his own bookshelf. And of course, as a historian, I immediately saw clues, and I went and got all of those different books and made my own bookshelf exactly as he had his. And of course, the thing I learned, some of them are very important. Jacques Maritain, the great philosopher, was there. Also, the lessons of Felix Varela, and also there was a catechism book, and there were other books. I know that Oswaldo read some books about American history. He was very interested in it. The book "A Thousand Days" by Arthur Schlesinger. But the thing that I discovered upon reading all of these is that Oswaldo Payá was not a textbook philosopher. He actually brought life lessons to bear on his core beliefs about what was needed for Cuba. The books brought him ideas, and certainly this idea about rights was reflected in some of these texts and some of the philosophy. But I don't think of him as an abstract philosopher. I think of him as a philosopher of street, of people, of a living philosopher. And I found upon reading all the books that I'd only made part of the progress I wanted to make, because the real Oswaldo was not in those pages. It was in the lessons that he saw every day.
There's also a section in the book called "The Secret Library," where Oswaldo is in a forced labor camp, and he finds this library, which he has access to at this point. It's this moment, and he's reading all the books that nobody can read, that he can't read, and at the end of which he has this to say to the officers that ask whether he's been re-educated, and he says, "Yes, you have educated me. I will be your enemy for life. You have failed." Which I feel is a good place to end our conversation, because I know that a lot of you have so many questions, and there's a lot of you here. So I wanted to open the floor to questions for David and Rosa from anyone in the audience.
No. Yes.
I have read and it's always pointing in the form, the order, the depth of each of the books, especially that time. It's what really there is something that I want to clarify in quite important. I have to do with this, of course, in my own file. Cuba, when Castro took power, totally the Constitution of 1940. They decided after a short while in power to replace that with a very improvised, let's say, a constitution that they wrote. And after that, there was another one, and now there is a new one that has deleted some of the rights that were that stayed in the former two. And when we had to do this, we tried to create a political party there before and all that. We found that incredibly, the constitution that they created had still had some rights that came from ideas that were in Cuba before, established in the 30s and before the Constitution of 1940 was created. Cuba had many constitutions since the time of the fight for independence. In the middle of all that, there were very intelligent people preparing different constitutions one after another. The one of 1940 was a very, very advanced constitution, even for present standards in the world. But when Castro decided to create his own constitution, he left there the right to ask for signatures to create a political party. If the people, if there were 10,000 signatures, they left that right there. What happened was,
So let me just ask what the, absolutely, yes, this is at the center of the book, just the question.
because of their own constitution. And when we went to Yale, they simply decided to apply that in their own way. Say, well, that is theirs. But if you try to collect one signature, another signature, and the third signature, you are going to come to prison. And that's what happened before. Then that changed later because they obviously there was a pressure in the world, and that's why this was successful. They were doing so. There was a change. It was their own.
Yes, absolutely, it was from yes. So I would encourage everyone, if they have a question that they want to ask, but we're gonna have a lot of time, and we can stay, and we got some wine after and exchange stories. So many people have so many stories here, and that's a great value. But questions? Yes. Yes.
I'm pretty loud. I can do it. So, David, I know you're a phenomenal reporter, and I just wanted to know what you found that was most interesting that you kind of dug up and shed new light on, or shed a light on in the book that was the most consequential in your view.
Going back to my very first question, what does it take? The answer I found was surprising. We oftentimes think of people that do these things as sort of caricatures, as great freedom fighters, whatever, but actually, in Oswaldo's life, I found a lifetime of dedication that involved trial and error, learning a path one way, then pulling back in another way. And to watch how he did that was such a revealing thing to me, because I asked myself, would I have that courage, that determination? Friends of Oswaldo have told me, and family members, that he had this idea from a very, very young age. They were amazed that he always had this single sort of North Star, but he didn't know how to get there. The idea, for example, of using the Constitution against the state itself, of leveraging that by seeking signatures. Well, when he first started seeking signatures, the state tried to crush it. They staged acto de repudio against the House. The signatures were knocked off a table onto the floor. People were beaten up. Would you get up the next day and say, I won't give in? He's knocked off a bike when he's riding home in the middle of the night. Why? Would you get up and say, I won't give in? The Varela Project involved years of effort, door to door, in not only Havana, but all over the island, talking to people about their fears. So what I see here is the lesson of a lifetime of determination after a singular goal. It's quite inspiring and also revelatory, because we see that this effort to fight dictatorship and totalitarianism is not black and white. It's not simple. It's a long, hard road, and we can learn from it. And I would just add too, we read now in the headlines. Yes, I know the mic high. But you read in the headlines now about people in Ukraine fighting for their freedom. I have friends in Belarus desperately fighting for democracy. People in Burma trying to resist their democracy was stolen. And I ask, what are they going through? I hope every one of them reads this book to see this is how it's done.
Find people who were equally inspiring, or this each of projects such as the Vanessa project, or was he one of, and that's it?
Well, I tell the story of some before the revolution who certainly were inspiring, including Gustavo Gutierrez and Eddie Chavez. So in the history, there are people. But now, not so much. And most of the people that worked with Oswaldo have left. And I found them here. And I found them in other places, but not in Cuba. The most remarkable thing was on July 11th, tens of thousands of them, of Oswaldo's spiritual children, actually went to the streets with demanding the exact same thing that he had been talking about all those years. For me, it was an eye-opening movement that the hard work he had done door to door was still in the minds of people. And this is the point. These totalitarian states cannot kill an idea.
Sí, I ask a question in Spanish. Sí, a lo largo de la historia, el pueblo de Cuba en ciertas ocasiones ha conseguido estar en el centro de atención de la sensibilidad del pueblo de los Estados Unidos. Esto se ha conseguido en ciertas ocasiones. A veces a favor de la libertad, a veces no ha sido a favor de la libertad. Usted como periodista, señor David, puede decirnos algo de qué tenemos que hacer para que volvamos a estar de alguna manera en el centro de la sensibilidad y de la atención del pueblo de los Estados Unidos en términos de a favor de la libertad.
I can translate very quickly for everyone. There have been moments where the Cuban story and the Cuban people have been at the center of the United States' attention, or the center of the press, perhaps for or against liberty. What do you believe are the things that Cuba can do to gain back that center? Yeah.
I will speak briefly, but I think Rosa María will be far more eloquent. But in my view, Oswaldo's statement that we must be the protagonists of our own history and not the spectators means that democracy from Cuba must come from the Cubans themselves. It must come from within. And I know in the United States, many of us for many years have thought about Cuba and tried to influence it, but we are not going to create a free Cuba. But Cubans, all of them, but especially those within Cuba, will. And that's my...
On that same comment that you made, and this might sound really simplistic, but I'm really curious to know your opinion and the lady to your right. It happened recently that the women are the ones that are started to complain loudly, and some of them even went out to the street to protest. I've been telling my wife all along, and she says, you know, maybe it's a tough one, whatever. But you were saying it has to come from Cuba. That's my opinion. The only way, we have several examples in Europe or whatever that they came out. I think the very only way it's going to happen is going to be everybody to the streets, but my idea was that it should be the women. The men stay at home. Seriously. Because the world is going to watch. They're not going to callar, okay, women, and if they all go out, and they all go out with a backpack, so the last 10 days, the whole country paralyzes, the world will be watching, and in my opinion, it's the only way this is going to end. They have to go out on the street. I wish it would be July 11th, 2022. Now it's kind of easy to spread the word. But for me, I would like to know your opinion because I see that as really the only thing.
I must ask
a woman there.
I admire greatly the Cuban women that are, just as you said, taking the front lines of this fight. Is that my mic? Aquí me oyen. Aquí me oyen. Now, I believe that this is a fight of all Cubans, and all Cubans means men, women, people in the island, the diaspora, all the generations, those that sink more to the left, those that sink more to the right, everybody. This is not even, of course, that it has a generational element, but this is all the generations in Cuba want freedom. And you saw it in July 11th, and these are old ladies and teenagers that are now in jail. There are dozens of minors right now in jail just for standing out in the streets and demanding freedom. I do believe that element, the people in the streets or the citizen mobilization, that element is key and is fundamental, and that's all about the protagonic role of the Cuban people. But my father also said that the Cuban people live in the island and outside the island. It's the same nation, so we also have a responsibility. And we have the responsibility to make those voices count, to elevate those voices, and to find a ways in which those that are in the positions to take decisions in favor of the Cuban people actually take it. So we also need the international community. But at the end of the day, it's a call for unity, and we could just sit down and wait for the next Oswaldo Payá to appear in our history. But I think that what Oswaldo Payá is telling us is, hey, take your own responsibility and join the fight.
I do have a question based off of that. As a frustrated Cuban American hyphenite who feels like not only translating language, but translating culture or plight. And I find that it is extremely complicated to explain to anybody outside that has not lived a totalitarian experience or has lived with people who have lived totalitarian experiences, essentially Americans. We have, I feel like we have trouble translating what's going on. And so I think that's part of the big thank you that we all have to you. It's like, look at you! You don't look like us and you're telling our story. But what do you think is the connective tissue that is gonna allow us to be able to communicate to other people what's happening? Because I feel like we talk and we talk and we yell and we scream, and there's I feel a propaganda machine working against us. So how do you kind of Oswaldo Payá your way around that?
No, that's for you.
When Oswaldo championed the Varela Project, Fidel saw this as a huge challenge to his legitimacy because he was always the one who mobilized the masses, right? And here was somebody who was mobilizing people by the thousands. And after the project was submitted, Fidel arrested 75 people. I think some 44 of them were directly working on the Varela Project, and the others were independent journalists, librarians, and so on. Today, there are 10 times as many people who were arrested for going to the streets just a year ago. There are over 700. I think that the facts speak for themselves. I don't know about you, but I get very, very emotional about what's happening in Europe. We have a war for freedom in Europe. What I see in Belarus and Ukraine and in Burma, and what's happening in Cuba is at the front lines of the values that we as a country stand for in this world. I don't know how many of you have been paying attention, but both two enormous powers in this world, China and Russia, have decided that our values are nothing, that they will govern the world without us. In fact, they're starting to talk about this very openly, that there's a new system that of their kind of, they call it democracy. It's a joke. And if we don't realize that there's a darkening of the hopes for democracy in this whole world, big countries with nuclear weapons and huge power, we're in trouble. People also worry, rightly, about our own democracy and strengthening it, making sure that it works. And so, to me, this is not a question of propaganda and shouting. It's really a question of realizing we are in trouble, and there are front lines, and Cuba's one of them.
I think that the Cuban community, and I'm part of that, can learn a great deal from the Jewish community. It was mentioned before that people don't pay as much attention to the issues that have come up in Cuba. But I am very well aware that the Jewish community has done an exceptionally good job at explaining the atrocities that were committed against them. I think we can learn from them. I also think that there are examples done by Cubans, even though they may not be as, I guess, as glorious or as the one in your father's case. But there are cases, for example, writers like Leonardo Padura, who in his books, or at least the one I read, he describes something that I think people outside of Cuba can connect with. And I also think that bringing attention to the Cuban Constitution of 1940, which I am pleased to say, growing up, my father always told me what a great thing that was and how talented and honest were the people who created that Constitution. I think it is important for us to let people know that too. Do you agree?
I would just say chapter 1, 2, and 3.
I'm sure this is going to be a fantastic book about Oswaldo, his person per se, and his legacy. What about the possibility of translation to Spanish?
It's a good question because a lot of people would like the Spanish translation, and I would just urge you to get the word out about the book, because if it does well, Spanish translation will follow. The translation will come if the book is successful, so help me out.
I'm also curious, I do want to thank you so much for bringing the story of Oswaldo Payá, the struggle of liberty. This is a question for you, David, but also for your publisher. Are they booking you in talk shows to promote the book so that the story gets out to the American people? Because you're preaching to the choir. And I think must be told to other countries, other people, not only the Cuban people.
Well, I love the choir.
I have a question. I have a question. 10 years ago, during the velorio, entierro de Payá, en La Habana, estaba ahí, seguridad del Estado, to open buses and took everyone away. I'm sure you wrote about that in the book. I'm going to buy your book and read the details. I could never understand why that moment when Figure One and Payá were just killed, assassinated with Harold. It was allowed for the bosses of Seguridad del Estado to show up there and start taking people away. How come we gave up that space, that time, and let them steal the show?
They are an state with all his resources, all his weapons, all his money against families. That's how they steal the show. Although I respectfully disagree. I do believe that that day, the thousands of Cubans that were there gave a testimony of freedom, and the chanting that we heard in July 11, for me, was echoing the chanting for freedom, libertad, 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 that I listened when the body of my father was in the middle of the church.
So we need to get this story out. We need to look towards the future. And how do we get this story out to young adults and future generations? Because like you said, sorry?
I said write books about it.
But how do we get it out?
I think Rosa Maria should answer this because she's done such a terrific job on this already. Tell us about Pulitzer and tell us how do we get this.
I do believe that each of us has the responsibility to do it. And now each of us have this equipment in our hands, and everybody is listening to this, at least, I don't know, the half of the day, watching that. So we have to become agents of change, wherever we are, wherever we sleep at night. It could be Pina del Rio, it could be Guantanamo, or it could be Hialeah or Orlando. We have that responsibility, and I'm not going to get tired of telling that again and again and again. It's our job. That was exactly what my father was saying. Everybody, he was not signing the Varela Project and delivering. He was looking for signatures. Okay, you want freedom? Do your job. Do your part of this. And our part is also to tell the story. Our part is also to show also our pain, also our suffering. You, sir, you have a very good point about the youth and how that people have been able to effectively transmit their story to the rest of the world. We need to do the same, but we also need a call to action. And that's what we do with Cuba del Siglo, but that's what my father was doing too. And that's what the people in the streets last summer was asking for. And it's cambio de sistema, change in the system. That's our goal, right? That has to be our unity of purpose. I'm sure that if we just sit down and start to talk about politics, life, social opportunities, and cultural things, we're going to differ a lot. But if we could just get united under one purpose, with our different of opinions, with our different styles, and we're to push toward that direction, I do believe that no one can ever stop us, and I do believe that we are actually walking as a people towards that direction right now, so that's an open invitation.
Thank you all for coming tonight. And thank you as well. I'm going to turn it back over to Christina, who will tell you what we're going to do.
I also cannot help thinking. I can't help thinking as I listen to all this inside a bookstore that I have spent 20 years working in. How important, how I feel that Oswaldo's message was also about going within, going deeply within and examining your own conscience and having some kind of power from the knowledge of that and of yourself. And I may not be articulating this very well, but I'm very moved by that message, especially tonight. I think we're in a house of ideas. We're surrounded by books, and it's very important to keep thinking, reading, and engaging with all of those things, and to be an agent of change. And I just thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's been an honor, a privilege, and just a wonderful Books and Books evening. Amen. So thank you.